No one ever thought an old dog could find a lion deep in the forest. Even fewer would believe that they were once a family. This story doesn't begin with a roar, but with silence. The silence of separation, of longing, and of a heart that could no longer wait. That night, the dog walked away from the old ranger outpost. No one knew where he was going. But when the old forest ranger found him, what was waiting ahead was not death. It was a miracle, the kind that only happens once in a lifetime. Dawn rises late over the Serengeti grasslands during the dry season. The mist has yet to lift, the wind still carries a chill, but Mackay had been up long before first light. He poured water into an old aluminum kettle, set it over the wood-burning stove, and waited for the whistle to echo through the small kitchen, a room cloaked in the shadows of overhanging leaves. He had lived at this ranger outpost for over 30 years. He'd walked every stream, etched his name onto the map with blood and the scars on his hands. But now he no longer ventured far. His legs ached when the wind changed, and the pen in his hand had long since replaced the silent rifle hanging on the cabin wall. The black dog lay at his feet, eyes half closed. Raka wasn't the kind of dog that barked much. He simply followed quietly, ate, and rested beside Mackay as he scribbled a few lines into his daily journal. This year, Raka had grown old too. Both of them had learned not to say much anymore. Mackay had lost his wife to malaria during a season shift, and his son had fallen during a final confrontation with poachers. Since then, he had lived with the wind, with the fire, and with silence. He once believed that nothing in this life could change him anymore, but the ancient forest never stays quiet for too long. That morning, Mackay woke up as he always did. He reached down from his hammock, expecting to pat Raka's back, but his hand met only cold, empty space. He called out softly. No paw steps replied. Raka usually rose before him, waiting quietly as his master brewed tea. But today, his sleeping spot hadn't even warmed. Mackay stepped onto the porch. The first light of day had just broken through the dry acacia branches. No paw prints, no barking. Raka had never left without a sign. Mackay wasn't afraid, but the silence gnawed at him like a grain of sand in a boot. Not urgent, but quietly unbearable. Near midday, as the sun climbed high and the mist had cleared, a rustling sound came from the edge of the thicket. Raka returned. His black fur was matted with red dust. His front paw limped, his muzzle smeared with blood, and between his teeth, dragging across the earth, was a small creature, soft fur bristled, barely moving. Mackay jolted. He instinctively reached for the old rifle hanging by the door, loaded it without thinking. A reflex born of seeing Raka bring back lizard squirrels, even firebirds as prey. But then he froze. It wasn't prey. It was a lion cub, barely 3 months old. Blood dotted its ear, still breathing, but barely. Raka gently laid the cub down, then licked its face, not the wound, but as if to comfort it. Then he lay down, breathing hard, his head resting across the little creature like a warm blanket. Raka had once torn a hyena apart just for straying too close to the outpost. But today he lay there like a mother. And when those tiny eyes slowly opened, a question began to stir deep in Mackay's heart. Mackay set the rifle down, stepped into the outpost, and pulled the radio from the wall-mounted shelf. He switched it on the familiar static, filling the air. All he had to do was press a button and report injured lion cub near the station, requesting pickup team. His finger hovered just above the transmission button. Then a memory surged back. A dry season, 30 years ago. He had once freed a buffalo calf from a trap, saving it from dying of thirst. 3 days later, he was removed from the post for interfering with natural processes. He was younger then, more stubborn, and still believed that doing the right thing never needed permission. Outside on the porch, the lion cub lay curled, its chest rising in shallow, trembling breaths. It opened its eyes. That look stopped him cold, not wild, not in pain, just a quiet panic like a child lost in a crowded market trying not to cry, just hoping someone might understand. He had seen that look once before long ago in his son's eyes as he lay dying in Makai's arms after a failed pursuit of poachers. Back then, blood spilled from the boy's chest like red twilight, and he had whispered only one thing: "Don't leave me here, Dad." Makai stepped outside, said nothing. He lifted the small, shivering creature into his arms and carried it inside. In one corner of the house stood an old wooden crate once used for storing maize. He lined it with straw, laid the cub gently inside, and lit a small fire beside it. Raka sat close, his eyes never leaving the strange child. Makai used a hollowed bamboo tube to drip cool boiled water into the cub's mouth. Its lips twitched. Its throat quivered. It swallowed little by little. Makai didn't promise to raise it. He only promised not to let it die alone. As the sky turned a dusky ash gray, he leaned back against the wall, watching the little creature curled in the firelight, and murmured a single word: Tala. In Swahili, it meant born from red earth. What he didn't know then was that this decision would change the course of the rest of his life. Tala recovered slowly, but little by little. At first she ate only a little breathed, with a wheeze often jolted awake in the night, curling tightly into the wooden crate, as if afraid someone might drag her from the only refuge she had. Makai didn't pet her much. He understood some creatures need to be left in peace to come forward on their own. You don't pull them closer, you wait. Raka was different. Raka lay beside Tala almost every night, sometimes stretching a leg to let her rest her head, sometimes licking her neck when she began to tremble. When Tala had a mild fever, Raka didn't move an inch, just watched, and laid himself down like an old mother who'd done this before. Makai began teaching Tala in the language of patience. He didn't spoil her, but he never raised his voice. She was taught to relieve herself outside the hut, not to bite hands, not to use her claws when playing. When she broke something, she was punished with a long, steady stare and a delayed meal. But every time she behaved, he scratched gently behind her ears, and she'd close her eyes like a kitten dozing off. Tala grew quickly. One morning, while Makai was writing in his journal, he felt a warmth by his feet. Looking down, he saw Tala curled up asleep, her head resting on the tip of his boot. Raka lay beside her, one paw touching her tail, as if to make sure they were still a team. One day, a hyena howled near the station. Raka barked. Tala sprang up, let out a low growl, and ran to the door. No one had taught her to protect. She just did it by instinct. Or perhaps something deeper. In the evenings, Makai brewed tea and carried it out to the grass in front of the hut. He'd sit under the old acacia tree, his back resting against the trunk, his journal open in his lap. Tala lay on his left, Raka on his right. 3 beings, 3 worlds, 1 porch, 1 fire. The ranger station began to feel like a small home in the heart of the wild. No promises were ever spoken, but loyalty, gratitude, and kinship grew quietly like trees rising through the dry season. But the older Tala grew, the more the forest began to whisper through her blood. One morning near the end of the dry season, the air heavy with red dust and weary heat, a surprise arrived at Makai's humble ranger station. A documentary crew and 2 scientists from the Central Wildlife Conservation Institute appeared with cameras, audio gear, and eyes as cold as glass. They came to survey the ecosystem of the nearby forest. But within minutes of stepping into the packed dirt yard, every gaze shifted toward Tala, who was lying curled in the shade, head resting on Raka's paw, eyes half closed, tail gently tapping to the rhythm of her breath. When the camera turned her way, Tala lifted her head and let out a soft growl, not of anger but a primal warning to an unfamiliar object that smelled of nothing real. The air changed instantly. "She's dangerous," a young scientist whispered. The cameraman slowly stepped back. Another voice spoke with finality. "This violates protocol. No one is allowed to keep predators in a residential zone. She needs to be relocated and have her hunting instincts restored." Mackay rose, one hand braced on the table. His voice was calm, but his eyes had lost their usual warmth. He told them that Tala had never attacked anyone, that she'd been raised from a helpless cub, that she lived with a dog, not a pride. That she didn't know how to kill, didn't know how to hunt, that she believed she belonged here. They listened, or pretended to, then opened a tablet and played back the freshly recorded footage, Tala looking straight into the lens, growling, low ears pinned back. To Mackay, it was a warning growl. To them, it was defensive behavior with aggressive potential. One of the specialists spoke in a flat, emotionless tone. A lion that growls no matter how softly is still a lion. Mackay gave a tired smile. Wry, worn. Then if I breathe hard, does that make me a hurricane? No one answered. Mackay looked at Tala being gently groomed by Raka as always, and saw a future already beginning to fracture inside her growing frame. Tala now stood as tall as his hip. Her coat grew thicker by the day, her claws sharper, her teeth longer. Love was real. But so were laws. People fear what they don't understand and they destroy what they can't control. Mackay didn't sign the handover that day, but he knew. From that moment on, the clock had started counting down. They would return armed with higher orders and forces he couldn't stop. Tala didn't know that the gate would soon swing open, not to bring her home, but to take her away. There was no rain on the day they took Tala away. The pale sunlight fell quietly over the dry ground, casting everything in a soft orange haze, like memory crumbling into dust. Mackay stood at the doorway of his hut, his hand resting gently on Raka's head. The black dog stood still, didn't bark, just stared at the transport truck as it backed into the yard. They arrived on time. Two people wearing conservation uniforms, their jackets marked with the organization's logo. They said little. Their movements were clinical, as if collecting an expired specimen from storage. The steel cage was lowered. Tala was let out, no leash needed. She followed like a sleepy child, no resistance, no growl. When the cage door closed behind her, Tala didn't look at anyone. She simply lay down, rested her head on her front paws, eyes open but empty. Raka strained against his leash as the truck began to roll away. Mackay held him tightly. The collar pulled taut around his neck, but Raka didn't howl. He only growled softer with each passing second. As the vehicle faded into the distance, its engine a low hum dissolving into the red dust, Raka stood at the edge of the path for a very long time. He didn't return to the house, didn't step forward. His tail, once wagging every time Tala called, now hung limp still as a brittle branch. Mackay sat beside him. Neither said a word. No one offered comfort. The silence hurt more than any cry. When Raka finally turned and quietly walked back toward the cabin, Mackay knew something in the dog's heart had just been lost forever. Night fell quickly. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rotting wood and distant forest. Raka didn't come inside. He lay on the porch, tilted his head to the sky, and howled. A low, choked howl. Not long, not loud, but again and again, as if he were asking, "Where are you?" and no one could answer. Inside, Mackay sat with a bamboo pipe, drawing slow, heavy breaths of tobacco. His eyes were red but dry. No one witnessed that moment. No cameras recorded it. No headlines reported it. But that night, in the darkness, 3 souls, 1 man, 1 dog, and 1 lion, were no longer together. Sometimes emptiness isn't in the sound, it's in the space where someone is no longer present. That night, Raka's howl was a farewell that needed no words. After the day Tala was taken, Raka became little more than a shadow. He didn't bark, didn't eat, no longer cared to step off the porch. Each time Mackay placed food in front of him, he would simply look at it, then turn away. At night, he no longer howled. But sometimes Makai would see him lying with his face toward the door, eyes open, watching the red dirt road that led into the deep forest where Tala had disappeared. On the seventh night near midnight, Makai was startled awake by the sound of wind whistling harshly through the shutters. He rushed outside, only to find the leash dangling loose from the wooden post. Fresh paw prints smudged across the sand in front of the porch, then vanished into the darkness like ink bleeding through damp paper. He didn't call, didn't shout, just exhaled, picked up the worn collar and ran his finger gently over the faded engraving Raka. Makai went back inside, lit the oil lamp, gathered his machete binoculars map and 3 days' worth of dried food. Before leaving, he folded a piece of paper in half and tucked it under the teapot. It read, "I'm going to find what I still owe." No one knew he left that night. Only the moon bore witness, casting its quiet light on the rocky, thorn-lined road ahead. The forest breathed in strange tones, the wings of a hunting bird slicing through canopy, a monkey's distant cry, the crunch of dry leaves beneath human steps. He didn't move fast, but he never stopped. His eyes scanned every mound, every snapped branch. The wind carried the scent of animals of earth, and sometimes faint traces of a place he once called home. He didn't leave because of hope. He left because love cannot sit still. Midway up a ridge, he stopped to rest. Beside the damp edge of a slope, he saw the faint outline of a dog's paw print, and next to it a dragging mark, as if a body had been pulled. There was blood, too, dried dark brown into the soil. Makai stood up, shouldered his pack, and pressed on, not knowing that the one who went ahead had already left a trail of blood behind. The forest at dusk is never truly silent. Scattered sounds, the flap of a hawk's wings, the quiet crack of dry branches reached Makai's ears like soft taps in an unwritten symphony. But that evening, a sound shattered every rhythm, a roar, sharp, splintered, dragging long like metal scraped across stone. He froze, his heart clenched. It was Tala. Without thinking, Makai sprinted toward the sound, crashing through brambles over roots down steep slopes. Branches whipped his face, blood streaked his brow, but he didn't stop. Every step felt tied to a thin thread between life and loss. Tala was caught. A crude but effective trap, a metal clamp dug deep into her front leg, blood pooling beneath dead leaves. She thrashed, screamed, tried to yank free. But the more she pulled, the more the metal tore into flesh. Her mane was matted with blood and dust. Her eyes blazed with pain, with fear. Raka had found her first, so much smaller but unmoved by fear. He barked wildly, bit at the wire holding the trap, desperate. Then, from behind the bushes, a man appeared, iron rod in hand. He shouted, then swung, striking Raka across the back. The dog yelped, fell, then leapt up and bit down on the man's leg. Blood sprayed. Another man rushed in, raising a stun gun. That's when Makai burst through the foliage, rifle raised, shouting in harsh Swahili, like the old days when he commanded patrol teams. The shot into the sky cracked through the canopy. Birds scattered, the poachers startled. One ran, the other turned knife, raised, charging. Makai dodged, blocked with the butt of his rifle, then countered with a kick to the gut. The man flew back, hit a tree trunk, and went still. Makai rushed to Tala, dropped to his knees. She was panting hard, frothing at the mouth. Blood still flowed. He tore off his jacket, wrapped it around her leg, pulled it tight. Raka lay a few meters away, whimpering, his belly fur soaked crimson. Makai knelt between them, one a symbol of the wild, the other his lifelong companion. His hands trembled, but his eyes held no hesitation. In that moment, he wasn't a ranger. He wasn't a keeper of rules. He was just a father protecting the children who didn't share his name. The forest wind howled, carrying Tala's broken roar through the air. Sunlight spilled across her bloodied body in long red streaks. In that space, thick with blood, breath, and resolve, Amid snarls, pain, and wind, something miraculous was about to happen. Tala was still breathing, but faintly. Her mane soaked with sweat and blood, eyes half open, her head drooped against the muddy ground. When Mackay reached her and knelt at her side, he gently touched her bloodied flank. His throat was too dry to form a single word. Tala blinked. She didn't growl, didn't flinch. She simply looked at him, then slowly lifted her head, trembling, dragging her blood-smeared cheek across his sleeve, then leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his chest. That moment had no music, no dialogue. Just an old man covered in dirt, a lion bleeding out, and something unseen pulling two souls back to the one place they belonged. Nearby, Raka stirred, let out a faint whimper, like the exhale of someone waking from a long dream. Mackay crawled over, kneeling beside him, checking the wound along his back. Not deep, but bruised, bleeding. Blood had dried on his forehead, his eyes still heavy. Tala turned her head, took a single deep breath, and bent down to lick Raka's brow, a silent apology. Mackay tore his shirt, wrapped it around Tala's leg to stop the bleeding, then spread the rest beneath Raka to give him a place to rest. None of them spoke. They only breathed. They only felt. Above them, the rain began to fall, not heavy, but just enough to wash away the dust and blood, just enough for the smell of wet earth to rise into the air. Mackay leaned back against the tree eyes, looking up into the dark canopy overhead. One hand rested on Raka's back, the other gently on Tala's shoulder. He didn't hold them, didn't pull them closer. He just touched to know they were still there. No words were needed, no promises. Only shared blood to know they belonged to each other. Tala rested her head on his leg, eyes now closed. Her breath slow but steady. Raka curled against his side. Mackay didn't need sleep. He only needed time to stop right here in this moment. He bowed his head, his voice rough and quiet, whispering not to anyone, but to the fire, the leaves and the old souls who might be watching from somewhere above. You two never spoke, but you did something humans forgot. You stayed until the very end. They say lions live by instinct, but sometimes memory is stronger than blood. 3 days after the forest had gone quiet, a rescue helicopter landed in the middle of a wild clearing. The response team found 3 beings lying side by side beneath the shade of an old mahogany tree, an old man thin and dust-covered, a black dog unconscious, but clutching an old shirt, and a lion with a tangled mane, her injured leg roughly bandaged, breathing, steady as if she'd never known claws or fangs in her life. Raka was placed gently atop Tala for transport, as if they were a single inseparable whole. The helicopter's blades stirred up clouds of dust, but Tala didn't flinch. She simply curled one front paw around her friend's body and held on. That image spread around the world. In less than a week, lion protects dog and vice versa. People were stunned, moved. They spoke of loyalty, memory, and a bond that transcended species. Under public pressure, conservation authorities proposed a humane solution, a semi-wild sanctuary 3 hectares wide, not far from the old station. It was designed so that Tala could roam freely, but still have contact with humans, specifically Mackay and Raka, under gentle supervision from researchers. Each evening, Mackay sat on the wooden porch, a warm cup of tea in hand. Raka lay beneath his chair, no longer frail, and from the shadows beneath the trees, Tala would step out quietly. She wouldn't roar, wouldn't cry. She would simply lie beside him, resting her head on his lap, just like the old days. The world called them animals. But here, we called each other friends. 3 silhouettes stretched across the golden dusk, not of the same species, but pressed into the earth like a true family. Sometimes what saves the world comes from the bonds we never fully understand.